Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Dr. Tammy Nemeth. Tammy's an energy analyst who's based in Oxford, England, but she spends a lot of time on this side of the pond. That's because she grew up in southern Saskatchewan and spends her summers here. She does a lot of work on the supposed energy transition and just how unrealistic that is. Hi, folks. Brian Zinchuk of the Pipeline Online Podcast. I'm running solo today here because my co-host, Bronwyn Eyre, has been spending more time in aircraft than most Royal Canadian Air Force officers these days. I'd like to bring on here my guest, Dr. Tammy Nemeth. And Tammy, I've got to know over the last several years, is one of the smartest people I know in this industry. Now, I say a lot of people I know are smart, but she's really up there. And a lot of people listen to what she's got to say as an energy analyst. Tammy, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for having me here today. I don't know what's up with my throat right now. I'm a historian by training, but I've been working in doing oil and gas and energy analysis for a long time now. And I research how the energy transition is going and how we're faced by a lot of energy realities. And I would say that we're more of an energy addition than an energy transition these days.
So one of the things here, and yeah, you're forgiven for coughing because usually I got a red button here that I push whenever I have to do that. Tammy here, she's been doing her own podcast. First of all, she has a thing called the Nemeth Report, and you also have a Substack. If you could introduce that as well. But every Monday at I think it's 7 or 8 in the morning Saskatchewan time, they do a live broadcast just like this. In fact, using the same platform I'm using here, called it used to be called the Energy Transition Report. Now it's called the Energy
Energy
Realities Report.
realities. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about first the Nemeth Report and then the other ones, because I really enjoy all of them.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. I love it when you come on and you ask questions because we always have on the live stream, people can put questions in there or comments or whatever. I have my own podcast called the Nemeth Report where I do about one or two every month of more in-depth conversations about people who are writing books on the energy space or want to talk about certain specific issues and whatnot. You've been gracious enough to come onto my podcast, so that's fantastic. The Energy Realities is every Monday. There's 4 of us. Irina Slav, who writes for oilprice.com, David Blackman, who has his own Substack and does his own podcast and is also a senior contributor to Forbes magazine. And then there's Stu Turley, the irrepressible Stu, who's got Energy Newsbeat and is very well versed in everything in the energy space. And so the 4 of us get on there every Monday and we talk about the different developments facing the energy space and how it's actually, we need to have energy realism when we discuss the different policy choices or what the different businesses, what kind of decisions that they're making and so on. And I would say the past 4 months since Donald Trump was elected has really changed a lot of what's going on, not just in the United States, but it's having ripple effects across the world. And I think also there's a lot of different things happening with respect to how far we can go with certain technologies in pursuing emissions reduction and what the energy realities are around that. And so that's often what we talk about on Mondays, which is always lots of fun.
It is a lot of fun, especially Stu's always got his cat videos there. I'm not sure why he's always talking about running his backhoe, and as a former excavator operator, that's a little bit near and dear to my heart. But I do post their podcast there on occasion on Pipeline Online. If you ever want to check it out, it's really worth the hour watching it because they really get into stuff, and these are people who know what they're talking about. David Blackman's done a bunch of stuff there on. I think didn't he write a book called something about the electrical grid? Was that Blackman?
No.
Oh, sorry, I'm thinking of someone else. But anyhow, so the energy transition, as that podcast was originally called, and now energy realities, that says a lot because people think, oh, we're just going to get rid of oil and gas. We're going to get rid of nuclear as well. And if you're German and or Spanish, and we're going to adopt wind and solar, and that has been, the narrative for the last 10 years under the Trudeau government here. We are by law supposed to get rid of coal. Saskatchewan is the last coal burning people, I think, for at least for power generation anywhere west of New Brunswick. And we're just supposed to get rid of it and build lots of wind and solar. Well, we've had some examples of that. Last Wednesday, for instance, Alberta's 5,688 megawatts of wind capacity fell to 8,
Yeah.
which 0.1% capacity, and there have been times where that falls to 0, and it's just utterly unreliable. So can you talk a little about that in the Canadian context and maybe then go into the UK context?
Well, for the past 10 years, as everybody knows, that Justin Trudeau has been pushing the net zero agenda. And they have the Net Zero Accountability Act, where supposedly there's these really hard targets that Canadians are supposed to meet. And one of the big priorities has been to decarbonize the electrical generation in Canada. Even though 80% of the electricity generated in Canada is supposedly clean, whether it's hydro or nuclear or however they wish to define that. And so what's left of that 20% is what's in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in the Maritimes, and some in Ontario and some in British Columbia, which is normally the natural gas or coal. And I forgot to add in there, of course, there's the requisite wind and solar, whether it be in Ontario. Quebec now is talking about installing lots of wind, and these other jurisdictions, provincial jurisdictions that are being pressured to invest in wind and solar and retire their current generating facilities, whether it's coal or natural gas. And unfortunately, with this last election, Mark Carney didn't talk at all about net zero. He wrote an entire book, several hundred pages, talking about how it's really important to get a grip on climate change and that we have to decarbonize and phase out fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. So he didn't talk about that at all during the election. He talked about during the leadership, he released his climate plan, and then once he won the leadership, he didn't talk at all. And it turns out that when he swore in his cabinet after he was declared leader, he had a side meeting, a special meeting with the environmental groups before the election. And you have to ask yourself, what was he telling them?
I never even heard about that.
Yeah. So did he say, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to push forward with the net zero agenda after I'm elected. I'm just not going to talk about it because it'll scare the people in Alberta and Saskatchewan and parts of Ontario or whatever." And so he didn't talk about it at all really during the election. Everything was about Donald Trump. And now he's got this national projects. He introduced this new act on Friday, Bill C5. So Monday they had the big meeting where the premiers got together. And they were going cap in hand, really, with their list of priorities of what they think is a national project that they want to see approved in an expeditious manner. And at the end of that day, the Prime Minister's office released this list of criteria, the 5 criteria of what it will take to be considered a project of national significance or whatever. And then on Friday, they codified those 5 principles into this new bill, the One Canada Economy Act or whatever it's called. But there was no detail. So what exact criteria will be used besides these 5 general points? 5 general points that could be made at about anything. There was the devil is always in the details, and there's no details in that at all. And so I wrote a piece about this on Substack on Friday. I'll probably have a piece in Energy Now elaborating a little bit more about this bill and these 5 principles and how there's a little there's a little statement in there that basically the cabinet will make whatever final decision. They can use whatever reasoning they want. It gives them basically carte blanche to make a decision on whether or not a project goes ahead. You have no idea what the criteria are. And so, after that meeting on Monday, you have the maritime premier saying, "Oh, Alberta and Saskatchewan want pipelines. Well, we want to ship wind power on a massive national interconnect to provide power to Alberta and Saskatchewan so they won't have to use coal and natural gas." And
It's
all I could think of is how absurd that is.
Well, so I wrote a piece about that last week. And I definitely did want to talk about this. So the same day on Nova Scotia has a highly produced video which they put out. Their premier Tim Houston, who has been a vocal advocate of the Energy East idea for building a pipeline, he says, "Yeah, we want to build a pipeline, but on the same right away, we want to build power line going west." And he said, and this is directly from the video. We have a capacity or we need 2.4 gigawatts. It's 2,400 megawatts of power capacity in Nova Scotia. But we're planning on building double that for wind, and we could build as much as I think it was 64 or 66 gigawatts. That would be 66,000 megawatts. And they actually said we could power 27% of Canada's power needs. And they even had the gall to call it reliable power. They said 40 gigawatts that could be reliable power. Now, just for comparison, 40 gigawatts is all of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba at the same time during a typical day. So that is a tremendous amount of power. They don't talk about the fact that you have, if you're using AC instead of DC, you have tremendous line loss.
Yeah.
I believe it's for every 200 kilometers, it works out to about 2% line loss. So, I mean, it wouldn't even make it past Ontario or even to Ontario. And then the whole idea that I'm just going to show my nice little wind pictures here. The thing about assembling these, and I've actually been on site when they were lifting some of these up near Assiniboia. You can't assemble them on a day when it's windy because the wind will blow it all over the crane. So the crane has to assemble these things when it's not a windy day, which means by definition, every single place that you see a wind tower is eventually going to have a day where there's no wind because they had to have that to build it in the first place. So the idea of saying that 40 gigawatts of power could be ever considered quote reliable from such a small location such as Nova Scotia is utterly ludicrous. I mean, if people want to build wind farms here or there and they want to spend their money, fine, but we can't rely on it to provide power to keep the lights on.
Well, you make a good point there about they talk about capacity, installed capacity. Capacity is not the same thing as actually producing. And so, for example, a few weeks ago, Spain had this massive blackout. They had 25 gigawatts of solar on the grid producing um, at that moment when it dropped to 10 gigawatts in like 10 seconds.
Yeah, it wasn't like 5 seconds. They lost basically almost all the grid.
Yeah, exactly. And because they have all these different interconnections, they're tied into Spain is tied into Portugal. They're also tied into France. And the only thing that stopped it cascading throughout all of Europe, because all of these different lines are interconnected, is that there was like this breaker that hit on the French side of the interconnection that stopped it from cascading throughout the rest of the European Union. And so Spain and Portugal, they had no inertia. So like when there's a natural gas turbine or a hydro dam or a coal power plant, there's these massive turbines that are spinning that if the power goes out, they can keep spinning and keep the um, the frequency going. But when the solar cut out, there was no inertia to take it up because part of the reason they had they were undergoing maintenance with some of their hydro dams and whatnot, and so that meant that there was not enough inertia on the system, and it caused this cascading effect. So
So
they were out for 24 hours. They was surprising that they were able to get the power back on. There's been quite a lot written about it. I trust the analysis of Catherine Porter. She's amazing. She really knows her stuff. She just released a report last week on the UK system and how putting so much wind on the grid and then trying to augment with solar and batteries actually makes energy unaffordable. And so she crunches the numbers to explain how the more unreliable electricity you put on the grid, the more expensive it comes to the consumer.
well,
And
and
yeah, go
Alberta's
ahead.
had exactly that. They doubled
Yeah.
their wind and solar, and they've had many days where the power goes to the theoretical maximum of $999 per megawatt hour. And so the Alberta Electric System Operator is looking at revamping all that. They want to double or triple it. I think they want to make it up to a maximum of 3,000 last I checked. I
Yeah.
think they got rid of the plan of having negative pricing. Thank God. But I wanted to show something here. I dug this out from behind my green screen. So, folks, this is came out of a shop vac. This is the motor for a vacuum, which is essentially the reverse of a generator. So, what Tammy's talking about here is you see the spinning part here? That's the armature, and a generator, even the big ones in power plants, is exactly the same. And the mass, the rotational mass of that thing spinning when it's many tons as it's going allows the power system to maintain uh, a steady state. And one of the things that I learned in the last year that I wasn't aware of before was this fact of we have this thing called frequency. Now,
Yeah.
everyone takes that in grade 11 physics, but never think about it ever again. So in the UK, it's 50 hertz. In Canada, it's 60 hertz. In North America, 60 hertz. And the entire grid has to operate within a very narrow band of 0.5% of plus or minus or 60.0 hertz. And when big generators fall off the system because there was a shortage or something trips or something happens, what happens is that means the load gets spread on everything else that's still there, and the frequency will dip a bit. And if it dips too much for too long, everything in the system is designed to automatically disconnect from the system so that they don't literally blow themselves to pieces, because it would be like having a car and having two wheels wobbling like this. If they wobble out of sync, one falls off. So the result is that the whole system is designed as what happened in France, that if it gets too far out of parameters, not France, sorry, Spain, and then
Spain.
France disconnected them. If it gets too much out of whack, to protect themselves from blowing themselves to pieces, they're all designed like that. And when they had the big thing in Texas back in February of 21, they were within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of losing the entire grid. They lost a good chunk of it. They would have lost the entire grid if it had stayed out of whack as much as they had. And this
Yeah.
is something that I think the Spain argument, it hasn't had a lot of discussion. We've seen some people talk about it. I believe that's exactly what took out the Spanish grid, is it not?
Yeah, they're not really sure exactly what caused that sudden drop in the power to the grid. There's lots of speculation. It happened from, I guess there was two particular solar farms from what has been pieced together, what they're releasing, because they don't want to release too much information. Um, but basically, when all that power dropped, there was nothing, there was no inertia to kind of keep the frequency going, and the frequency um, went all crazy, went haywire, and that's what caused the basically like a breaker went off in France, and then it took out Spain and Portugal. So, that's I think one element of being reliant on these interconnections, because the argument, at least in the UK, is that um, let me provide a little bit of context, because this will be something similar, I think, for what's going on in Canada. In the UK, they had coal power, they have nuclear, but some of it's aging, and it's been taking for like over a decade to get a new nuclear power plant built. It took forever to get the approvals. Then it's taking forever to get built because every time they start to do something, environmentalists say, "Oh no, there's a badger set. You have to stop and we have to move the badgers." And the same kind of stuff that they pulled with Trans Mountain. Oh, suddenly there's a hummingbird nest and we can't do any building and stuff until the nest is gone. That kind of thing. So it's taken forever to get the nuclear done. That last year Britain blew up their last coal-fired power plant just to demonstrate that they weren't going to bring it back ever. So they shut that down. Then they said we're going to build all this offshore wind, but there's not enough interconnections and whatnot to still supply enough of the UK. So that now they have to import electricity from Denmark, from Norway, from France, and I think there's even an interconnector to Ireland. So now they have to rely and they say, well, it's okay because we share electricity both ways. But for the most part, the UK is getting more electricity from these other countries than they're producing or giving to them in times of like when there's a lot of electricity and stuff. So one of the things is that Norway has built a whole bunch of hydro dams and they export their energy to Germany, to the UK, and to some other European areas. But for the two biggest draws are Germany and the UK. And when the UK has been having all this trouble with their grid, they've been drawing on Norway more and more because this huge interconnection was just turned on, I guess, about, I would say 6 to 12 months ago.
Right.
And when the UK's in trouble, the way the market works in Europe, and I don't fully understand it, it's very complicated, is that when they're short, they will buy whatever electricity they can at whatever price just to keep the lights on. So the spot price skyrockets, and it has a ripple effect to the people in Norway. So the people in Norway are being stuck having to pay way more for their electricity than they're used to. They're used to having very low, reasonable, affordable prices. And now suddenly it's spiking because the UK keeps draining the electricity from Norway. So they were going to build another interconnection, and the Norwegian people said, no, we don't want this. So you need to reconsider how you've been doing the contracts for these interconnections. So
they're not very happy about it at all, are they?
No, no, not at all, because the Norwegians are very used to having reliable, affordable energy. Whether it's, the natural gas for their heating, which now they're phasing out apparently, and they're promoting heat pumps. So, as we discussed before, Norway has really been promoting electric vehicles, and so for new vehicles, there's been a significant increase in the number of EVs that have been sold, but it's still around 30% or just under 30% of total vehicles on the road are electric in Norway. In any event, so there's all these new power consumption requirements in Norway at the same time that the UK is trying to get its electricity from elsewhere because it's not generating enough reliable energy of its own.
Well, and I think that's the key part there is that, there are days that, I have a little thing I get on my Twitter where the UK does get a fair bit of wind power and they get a lot. The problem is it's not all the time. It's not base load. And, these are the biggest considerations, not only there, but for Alberta, for Saskatchewan. Folks, we got about 72 people watching online right now. On any platform you're watching, if you comment, we will see that comment. And if you'd like to say something, or ask a question and interact with us, please do. We're going to go briefly to a commercial break here, and we will get back to you in just a second. So let me cue it up here first. There we go. And we'll be right back in 3 seconds. There's a reason that HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grime Sales and Service. That in Saskatchewan. So, Tammy, you were talking about heat pumps, and that was one of the things the Trudeau government came out and said. And this was a big impact actually for Canada. I just remembered this because when they said we're going to remove the carbon tax on home heating in Atlantic Canada, because oil furnaces used to be common out here. I had one as a child. My grandparents had one. Everyone had that. And in the West, because of adoption of natural gas, most of the home heating fuel is gone anymore for burning essentially diesel for your house. But in Atlantic Canada, it was not. And because of the carbon tax going up incredibly, it was becoming unaffordable to stay alive in Atlantic Canada. So they said, well, we'll give you a 3-year pause on the carbon tax. And but we want to incentivize you to put in heat pumps throughout Atlantic Canada. Can you talk about the experience of heat pumps? I know the climate is much more mild in the UK, maybe not so much in Norway, but can a Canadian climate handle heat pumps when it gets to minus 30?
So apparently there's newer versions of heat pumps that are suitable for some areas. But when it comes to the prairies, with the type of extreme temperatures that we've got, you what I've heard is that you just have to have a backup, and it ends up being like our electrical system, where they want to put in wind and solar everywhere, but then they still have to invest in a backup because the wind and solar don't work all the time. And the same thing with the heat pumps. The heat pumps will put temperatures at a certain level, but when it's really cold, they don't work very well. And unless you're doing like deep down into the ground, which is incredibly expensive and doesn't happen very often, it's extremely unreliable when it's cold, when you need it. And so then you'd still have to have like a natural gas backup or some other kind of furnace in order to heat properly. So just to give an example, when we lived in France, we lived near the Pyrenees where it was fairly mild. It was a very temperate kind of area. And there was a heat pump installed in our house. And in the summertime, it was fantastic because it worked like an air conditioner. So, kept the house nice and cool because it got quite hot in the summer. And in the wintertime, it didn't get that cold. But there was a period between, I would say, mid-December until early February where it would get, cold for that area, which is like minus 10. Minus 10 in Saskatchewan, we're like, come on, whatever. It's not that cold. But in the south of France, that was really cold. And our heat pump froze up. And we had to have the fireplace going all the time. We had plug-in radiators just to keep the bedrooms warm and so on. And we had the technician coming out all the time trying to thaw the heat pump. Now, granted, that was, 10 or 15 years ago. I'm sure that they've improved since then. But what I'm hearing from people in the UK who are being forced to convert their heating to heat pumps, it's they're not very good when it gets cold. Once it gets below, say, 5 degrees outside, it's not very effective. And then people end up having to have plug-in radiators or fireplaces. So on the one hand, they're all like, you can't have emissions in any way. And then the only way people can keep warm is to have a fireplace going. And
Which
in
are
some juris,
having had 2 fireplaces in our previous house, especially when you're not using them, they're pretty drafty, and they're one of your worst ways for keeping your house sufficiently warm because there's air. I don't care how well you close the damper, there's always air being sucked out of it. So, yeah, you're going back to biomass. You see,
yeah,
when we
I
when we
know, biomass.
when we on the farm there, we had the oil furnace, but because we couldn't afford the oil all the time, we had, in addition to that, we had a big wood stove that we filled. It was an efficient one, so we only had filled every few hours or once a night or whatever. But it was biomass in today's thing, wood. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that because the UK has really, gone hook, line, and sinker on this whole biomass thing. And if I understand correctly, they're actually cutting down trees in the American South, shipping it or pelletizing it or something to that effect, loading onto ships and sending it to the UK so the UK can feel good about cutting down trees to burn it to produce power. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they converted, I think it was a coal power plant called Drax, and it's owned by a company called Drax, and they use these wood pellets. Now, some of the companies argue that what they're doing is they're taking leftover wood from pulp and paper and other sort of processes. They take the leftover wood and they compress it into pellets, and that's what's getting shipped over. That very little actual new growth is being pelletized and sent over. Now, there was a special investigation done by an environmental group that claims old growth forest was being cut down in Canada and the United States, pelletized and shipped over. But what I heard was that there's some cases where yes, it maybe it's old growth, but they have no use for the type of size it is, or maybe there was some issue with it, and then that's why it was turned into pellets. And so it's not necessarily really good wood that's being turned into pellets and then burned, as it were, to create energy. But it's supposedly, this is what they say, is that it's wood that they wouldn't be able to use for other things that we would want, like planks and stuff like that. So I don't know the exact truth of the matter. All I do know is that there are pellets that are being burned in an old coal plant that they call biomass, in order to generate reliable electricity because it's heat, and that generates reliable electricity for the UK, which they need. They actually admitted they can't shut it down because the wind and solar is too unreliable. And what I want to add about the UK, and this is a really good lesson for Canada, is that they've just passed a bill that allows the national government to expedite projects of a national interest.
Oh,
And
geez,
what
where did
that
I hear that this morning?
exactly. And what's interesting about it is that a lot of the councils here in the UK have the authority to decide what goes on within their borders. And so the councils have a process, and a lot of them have turned down solar installations because it takes up farmland, and they don't want solar arrays to take up farmland because the UK is kind of small, and what farmland they do have still isn't enough to produce enough food for the people here. That's why they have to import. And so the farmers want to keep as much farmland as they can. And the counties agree because the British also like to do a lot of walking, and they like to walk through the fields. And there's all these paths that have existed for 1,000 years that people like to go walking on. But when there's solar installations, they put fences up all over, and people aren't allowed to walk through anymore. And honestly, it's ugly. They're absolutely ugly. So they've done such a good job of preserving the countryside here in the UK. And now the government has overturned at least three councils who have rejected solar installations, saying, no, it's of national interest. It's going forward. We really don't care the process you followed because we're doing it anyway. So the reason why this is significant and important for Canada is that Mark Carney was the advisor to this current UK government
Oh,
um,
imagine that.
before the election. And so before this UK government was elected last year, Mark Carney served as their economic advisor. He helped advise a lot of the different policies that we see coming out in the UK right now, which have been devastating people. Lots of tax increases, lots of super commitment to net zero, and all of these different kinds of things. And having national projects, which the national government, the federal government, just overrides local concerns. So that's something to look forward to in Canada. I hope that Canadians take away from the UK, don't do this, and actually um, push back on what they're going to deem a national project. Because if it's, well, you know what, we're going to set up all these wind turbines and solar installations and create these interconnections that run through your backyard, these high voltage interconnections, which are awful. That and you won't have secure and reliable energy in your province because it's going to come from somewhere else. That's something that Canadians need to really think about. Is that what we want to follow?
Okay, so I'm gonna throw up my pipeline picture here. This is line 3 replacement near, actually very close to your place near Sedley. This was at Vibank.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, so interesting perspective on that, because the exact opposite is being heard from the oil and gas community when it comes to pushing through national projects, because the idea of revising a northern gateway either to Kitimat or to what do you call it? Let's see if it's changed my different perspective here. Or to Prince Rupert.
Yeah. The Prince Rupert gas, the
Yeah,
PRGT, that their environmental assessment approval through British Columbia has been extended indefinitely. But I wonder if BC is allowed to do that because it only sources BC gas.
that is quite possible. But where I wanted to go with this is that kind of the opposite of what you're saying, in that you're saying do not let the feds push things through. So we had the meeting last week where the premier said, we want national projects, and then David Eby, who wasn't there because he was out on a trade mission, comes out and says, we don't want another oil pipeline to the coast.
Yeah.
And actually, the story I'll probably be writing up as I'm done this is that Polyev said, "Yeah, we need a pipeline," and the the thing is that a lot of people in the oil industry are saying if we don't have the federal government push through provinces that don't want it, i.e., the West Coast for British Columbia, for a Northern Gateway revival of some sort, or an Energy East, going out to the East Coast through Quebec. If someone can't say these things have to go through on the oil side, they're never going to happen. And I mean, the idea of bringing back an Energy East idea, which was supposed to have been built in December of 18. In fact, I've shown this before here. This is the keychain I used to keep in my keys when I bought a vehicle in 2014. This is my daily reminder of how Trudeau screwed Western Canada, because it says Energy East Pipeline. I was at an open house in the spring of 14 when I bought that vehicle, first place I went to, and it was supposed to be in service by December of 18. So it's 14 was this, in December of 18 was when that project was supposed to be done. And here we are, 7 years later, and we're still talking about, well, Quebec doesn't want a pipeline. So
Okay, so what I would say to that is that it sounds great to have the federal government say, you know what, we this is a project of national interest. We should, you shouldn't be trying to stop it, right? Because it's unfair of you guys at each end of the country be able to just say, no, we don't want this, and then stop development from the middle that's landlocked. The problem with how this is being situated by the federal government, and it's what I mentioned before, is that there's these 5 really general criteria. There's no specifics. It doesn't eliminate the underlying problem. Nothing of the current legislation that is the problem is being fixed. So talk about a Band-Aid. All this does is it puts this other new layer on there, and it's actually something that the Harper government tried to do, where supposedly the cabinet will have the best interests of the nation at heart and make these decisions on whether or not a project will go through. But the Impact Assessment Act and all of its requirements are still there. There's the tanker ban for oil tankers on the West Coast. That's still there. That's not being repealed. And there's the Net Zero Accountability Act. That's still there. So in order to meet those requirements, because number 5, if I pull it up here, number 5 is have clean growth potential. Oh, okay. Well, how does an oil pipeline fit into clean growth potential? And, when it says strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, well, that's pretty broad. Anyone could kind of make that argument. So I'd be careful what I wish for in the sense of having the federal government involved in this way, where the cabinet can really make an arbitrary decision based on rather capricious way of saying, well, I have these 5 general things, but my constituents in Quebec say this, and then someone's constituents from BC say something else. Well, what's the consensus? And then Mr. Carney was talking about consensus and what that will mean. And he said, oh, well, we're going to create a process to establish what a consensus is. Well, that's not in the legislation. So, on the one hand, it's like, yes, we need projects expedited. It takes way too long. There's all these different roadblocks up there. But I don't think this act is the way to do it because it doesn't get rid of the problem in the first place. It's just adding something else on top of something, like the core problem is still there.
So I wanted to, we're just going to go to a second commercial break here. Tammy, are you turning into a pumpkin at an hour, or can we go a little bit over if we got a little bit more? Or?
Yeah, sure. I don't care.
All right, so it's going to go to an ad here, folks. People, you can comment here. We definitely like to get you involved and hear what you think about this. While we go to commercial break here, Tammy, I'd like to stew on the whole idea of a decarbonized oil or barrel of oil that Carney was talking about. So we'll be right back. For your well servicing needs in southeast Saskatchewan and southwest Manitoba, you need the General. That's General Well Servicing of Cardiff, Saskatchewan. They've got a fleet of double, triple rigs, pressure vessels, and lighting rentals ready to serve you. They can perform rig assist and frac assist operations as well. Call Kevin at 306-482-3244. That's Call the General at 306-482-3244. Yes, sir. I want to thank General Well Servicing as well as Grime Sales and Service for being the sponsors of this podcast, which has allowed us to do this. This is actually going into the 6th month of this, and it's been spectacular. We've got 125 people watching right now, Tammy.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great.
So come on, people, get some comments in here. I was on the Evan Bray show here on CGME Talk Radio this last Wednesday, just a couple days after the whole Carney thing in Saskatoon. And he was talking about, decarbonized oil.
Yeah.
And, Evan asked me what that means. And I think it's a BS term. It's like saying we're going to take the H2O out of water because, hydrocarbons are carbon and hydrogen in different chains that, longer chains make for heavier oil, lighter chains make for lighter stuff. And it's the breakdown of a chemical bonds that provides the energy to do things like keep places warm and provide transportation. So the idea of saying we're going to take the carbon out of hydrocarbons is a load of bullshit. What are your thoughts?
Well, so Dennis McConaughey, who used to be with Trans-Canada Pipelines, he's going to be writing a piece in the Calgary Herald in the next few days explaining what he thinks decarbonized oil means. And it's one of these terms, like you say, it's really just a nonsense term, really, unless you break it down to be like, so the only oil that would be allowed into a new pipeline would be oil that has significant carbon capture. So that would be like the Pathways Alliance investing in this massive carbon capture project, having to construct the CO2 pipelines, have to capture it, to compress it, to ship it, to store it, and so on. And the environmental groups want the industry to pay for it all, to absorb that cost. And the industry is saying, look, it's possible, it's feasible, but it's expensive. And if you're forcing us to do it, then there should be some incentive for us to do it. And I think what Mark Carney is saying, that they will think about different tax incentives, or I think Alberta has put forward various incentives to facilitate that Pathways project. But the environmental groups, if you look at the Impact Assessment Act, they would come back and say, well, actually, it's not just the emissions from producing that oil, it's the emissions in using that oil that have to be accounted for too. So when that's what they call in ENGO speak is the scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 and 2 are the emissions that are created in generating the product, and scope 3 are the emissions generated from using the product. Well, let's say that you've shipped that oil off to China and they're now using our decarbonized oil, but they're still going to be burning it because when you use the oil, you're burning it or whatever, and it's releasing emissions. Then Canada would have to take that into account um, on whether on what our national emissions are,
Yeah,
if they
actually,
follow through with that.
you've done some writing about that, and I, honest to God, I don't understand the accounting part of that. You've written about. I think I've carried some of your pieces on this, and I think Deidre may have done some as well. Deidre
Yeah.
Garrick, talking about this whole idea that if you have a business, of X amount of size, you have to calculate not only your emissions, but also the emissions of your product. And, for instance, let's say I am an oil company. Well, not only do I have to calculate the emissions that we use in burning and stuff, but I have to calculate the emissions from the service rig and the drilling rig that are used to operate my thing. That would be scope 2 emissions. And scope 3 emissions would be I have to calculate the emissions of the final product at the other end of the pipeline downstream. And I have to calculate all of that. And I have to have an army of accountants that does all this and who apparently are supposed to know what they're talking about. I don't know where there's any training for that. Can you, am I totally out to lunch on this, or
No,
can you explain this to me?
that's pretty accurate. So one of the
That's
things
horrible
that
if it is.
it's horrible, and it's horrible in the sense that number one, you have to make all this accounting, and you have to, no matter what the size of your company, you'll have to do this reporting, and you have to hire accountants and specialists and consultants in order to help you do it because it is quite complicated. And Canada set up the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, where they've adopted the international standards for how you would account for all this kind of stuff. Um, the banks in Canada, the financial institutions such as insurers and banks, um, they already have to do this. That this has been the first year that they had to do this kind of accounting happened last year. And it's through the Office of the Superintendent for Financial Institutions. And so the banks have to keep track of what their emissions are. Now, what that also means is how they're financing things and the emissions in what they're financing. So let's say that Royal Bank of Canada has on their books, in their accounts, an oil and gas company. Then they would have to see what are the amount of emissions that that company is producing, and the bank will have to account for that. Now, one of the interesting things that Mark Carney has talked about repeatedly is that Canada must mandate this kind of accounting in business. So the thing is, if Canada mandates this for all corporations, and then the banks have to have a transition plan, and they have to set out what their targets are, and they have to meet those targets in say 5 years or 10 years, how do they reduce their emissions if they've set certain targets and they must meet them? If this is mandatory, and this is what Mark Carney has talked about a lot, um, then they have to start cutting. And so if you see a bank that's got a lot of emissions from somewhere, they might say, well, I have to, no longer finance that company because it's throwing off my emissions profile. Now, there are some people who say, now that Mark Carney's actually in power, he'll be more pragmatic. He won't actually adopt these things because they're economy killers, especially if the United States isn't doing it. And the United States is not doing this. They've withdrawn the rules that they were going to put forward with climate disclosures, and they were much less onerous than what Canada has subscribed to. So, how would Canadian companies compete with American companies that don't have to do any of this stuff? And this comes to decarbonizing oil. So, as they often say, oil is actually traded on the international market, and there's international prices. It's not like Canada sets the price for what they're selling it for. It's the price that Canadian companies get is what the international market has. Saudi Arabia is not decarbonizing their oil. No other jurisdiction is decarbonizing their oil. Maybe Norway, but Norway basically supplies Europe. So Canada's competing with these other jurisdictions. And if you go to the Canadian federal government website on its page about the roadmap for decarbonizing the oil and gas industry, which was written by Stephen Guilbeault, who's still in cabinet, by the way, it talks about how Canada needs to do this in order to be competitive. No, Canada does not need to do this to be competitive. The
Wasn't
only
that
place
in Paul, in Carney's book? I haven't had
Yeah.
a chance to listen to the audiobook yet. I've got through the first few minutes of it. I'm like, I have to go through this eventually. But that his values book that was all laid out in there, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And if you like, I've gone through a lot of his different speeches and his presentations and whatnot, and he repeats this over and over. And he repeated even as recently as last October, where he was in Beijing and he talked about the fundamental pillars in order to move climate finance to the where it needs to be. And number one is climate disclosures, make them mandatory. Number two is mandatory transition plans, which with targets that have to be met. And then I forget what was number three. Uh, I forget what number three was, but he goes through and he's super focused on climate finance. And this is what he said on Nathaniel Erskine Smith's podcast back in October as well, or September, October, where he talked about how he's Mr. Climate Finance. This is what he really cares about. This is the most important thing for the global economy. So he believes that. And his book is called Values. So that's one of his core values. You can't tell me that he's just suddenly thrown that all out the door. So at some point, that stuff's going to be sort of rolled out into the Canadian economy. I don't know when that's going to be. Maybe we'll get lucky and he's the kind of guy who doesn't hold true to his values. We can maybe hope.
Well, so I want to get back
So,
to the decarbonization thing here because this actually ties directly into what's happening in Saskatchewan as well as the oil sands pathways thing. Now, if I understand the Pathways project, it is basically we're going to capture the CO2, we're going to put it in a pipeline, we're going to send it down to the Cold Lake area, and we're going to put it into pore space. We're just putting it underground. You hear a lot of talk about pore space, whatnot. But I do not hear, unless I've got this mistaken, there is no plan to use that for enhanced oil recovery like they do at the Weyburn unit. Is that correct?
yeah, my understanding is that it will just be sequestered. Now, there
Which
have
is
been some
stupid because
studies.
I mean, almost every ton of CO2 that's captured could be used for enhanced oil recovery. And it would, if you are concerned about, emissions, which I'm not particularly, but if it allows you to produce more oil, in Weyburn, they found that for every ton of CO2 you inject into the ground, you get about another 3 barrels of oil. And it's actually one of the things Saskatchewan's considering is that if we rejuvenate the coal fleet, and it's a very serious possibility, SaskPower is looking at this very deeply, that because we don't have enough hydro out here, because nuclear has become so expensive, uh, and that decision hasn't been made yet either. But we're seriously looking at rejuvenating our coal fleet, rebuilding and extending the life of Boundary Dam, Poplar River, and Shant. And if they do this, if they put on carbon capture onto it, as they did with Boundary Dam 3, it wouldn't necessarily be to save the planet, although some people might say that. It would be more along the lines of it would allow us to produce. And I was at a presentation done by Gavin Jensen at the Wilson Basin Petroleum Conference a month ago, talked about how we could add an incremental 75,000 barrels a day of oil from doing that. And if you did the same thing, you took the CO2 from the oil sands and injected it into a reservoir that would respond to it, such as in the Lloydminster area where I know this has been tested, you could produce more oil. And if you are reducing the carbon footprint of it, if that's what a decarbonized barrel is,
Yeah,
but because the liberals under Trudeau would not give any sort of tax consideration for enhanced oil recovery, only for geological storage,
yeah.
that's why it's not being considered there. And I asked Daniel Smith about this at the Lloydminster Oil Show a year ago, and she likes the idea of doing CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, but that's not in the cards for Pathways, as far as I'm aware. Am I wrong on that?
No, you're right. And for precisely why what you said is that it doesn't count if it's used for an enhanced oil recovery. It only counts as emissions reduction if it's actually stored in a geologic location or stored in some, put it into concrete or something like that, where it's actually not going to be released in any way or even used to extract more oil. So even there's been some studies about using CO2 in a steam assisted gravity drainage well, and
Yeah,
that
Husky
wouldn't
worked
count.
on that for years.
Yeah, so I mean, it wouldn't count. towards any of these credits or whatever. It wouldn't count. They wouldn't count it because as far as they're concerned, if you're producing more oil, you're creating more emissions. So
So, there's another thing coming up here, and I've been beating this drum a fair bit. I'm not sure if you saw any stuff I've written about this, but back in October, Premier Mo talked about. I was kind of harassing him in my interview with him about the idea that I hadn't seen a lot of concrete action to reach the goal of 600,000 barrels a day when we've had roughly 450,000 barrels a day for most of the last 24 years. And he said, well, Brian, I'd actually like to see us hit 1 million barrels, which is effectively doubling oil production. Now,
yeah,
that also happens to be a goal of Alberta Premier Daniel Smith, is to double oil production there. And she talked about that at the Lloydminster Oil Show, and she talks about it every time she gets a microphone in front of her. The two of them are sharing a stage in Calgary on the 16th. That will. Sorry, you're about to blow up there. That they're going to be talking about, the drive to double oil production. And one of the ways to do that in Saskatchewan context in particular, because we're doing it right now, is by using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And
yeah,
I mean, the premier often talks about how Whitecap is a net zero oil producer because of the amount of CO2 they're putting in.
yeah.
I don't know how we could double production without doing more enhanced oil recovery of CO2. I mean, there are certain paths I've done a speech about, but I mean, it's a critical part for it. And I don't see why the people who are so concerned about CO2 don't like the idea.
Because it produces more oil. And the whole point is to stop using oil. So the people who complain the most about emissions don't want more oil and they don't want more gas, which is why they've been targeting natural gas, saying that it's not a clean fuel, even though that's garbage. That's why they first went after coal, then they went after oil. Now they're going after natural gas. It's to get rid of all hydrocarbons. So when you've got that kind of mentality, how do you negotiate with that? And unfortunately, the people running the show under the Trudeau government, and most of them are still there in
Just keep them in
cabinet,
cabinet.
they all agree that we shouldn't be using more hydrocarbons. Now, granted, the situation in Ukraine and with Russia has sort of stoked a whole new idea about defense. And honestly, you cannot have a reliable defense without hydrocarbons. The last time I've seen a solar tank is never. And
Yeah, you can't exactly plug them in to charge them up for 8 hours. Eh?
right, it's like, excuse me, we need to just have a break. I need to charge, and then we'll have another battle. Um, so I mean, that's kind of dropped off. Like the American Defense Department said, okay, we're done with all that stuff. NATO still hasn't quite given up on some of that climate stuff. Um, so now that there's this sort of reality, and this is once again comes to energy realities, is that if you think you're in a situation where defense is important, you you can't rely on unreliable energy for your defense needs. And so this is one of the reasons why you've got maybe new coal plants in America being restarted or permitting new ones. We talked a little bit about today on the Energy Realities podcast that there's two, maybe five in the pipeline in the United States to permit new coal fired power plants. There's been two or three where they're extending the life, maybe reopening some of the coal. So when you need reliable energy, and it's not just for defense, it's all this whole new stuff about AI, data centers, all of that. It doesn't operate with wind and solar and batteries. It eats up way too much energy, and there's a lot of different companies that are setting up the data centers and the sort of AI places where they're going to create their own power sources using natural gas or maybe coal. It's unclear. President Trump is certainly promoting coal as an alternative. Larry Fink back in January was talking about how AI is the next big thing. Data centers are really, really important. And we might just have to build more natural gas. And maybe that's one of the reasons why BlackRock has now been removed from the Texas AG's blacklist. with respect to investing.
Well, just this morning, the prime minister talked about increasing defense spending by about 50% this year to reach the NATO budget of 2%, even though they're now shifting that to 5% in short order. So I guess they didn't want to be left too far behind. But I wonder how much of that's going to be spent on battery powered fighter planes and battery powered tanks and destroyers.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because Canada says that it wants to be part of the new EU defense fund. So the EU is where the different countries pony up a bunch of money. They can also access different loans and stuff through this EU procurement system. And so then I'm thinking Canada's going to be buying European equipment. European equipment is notorious. All the different countries have their own stuff. I don't know how you're going to have, how we're going to do the parts. Are we going to have all these different things? How are we going to be compatible with the United States? He can talk about all he wants, how we're on a different path than the United States, but it's not, it makes no sense to be buying so much into the European system.
Sounds like you're getting hooked there from your alarm. So if you want to stay on before we hang up here, Tammy, we're going to call it a day here. We've had a wonderful discussion. Tammy, I'd love to have you on again in the future. There's always so much to discuss, and you've got such a great perspective, both a foot on both sides of a pond. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. And I'm going to be in Canada soon, and hopefully we can meet up in person.
I'll see if I can bring some coffee. Says, hang on for a second. I'm just going to hit end here. Thank you very much, folks. We had 141 of you watching towards the end. And next time, come on, speak up. We love conversing with you folks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Brian.
Take care.